Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to look at two challenges to cultural relativism and two challenges to subjectivism. So let's jump into it. Remember, cultural relativism is the view that morality is grounded in the morals of the ethical attitudes of one's culture, not surprisingly. So if your culture, we might say the mainstream beliefs of one's culture, if they disapprove of child abuse, then child abuse is wrong. But if we went to another culture where that was found to be morally acceptable, then it's morally acceptable. So there's no universal or objective morality that would span across eras or cultures. It's just whatever goes in the culture that you find yourself in. So there are at least two major problems with this view. One is that it doesn't seem to allow any moral progress. Do you think in the last 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, that we have made progress, moral progress, as a society? Most people do. So, for example, we don't enslave people anymore, right? At least not in our country. We have laws, so legal rules, but also moral rules, presumably, against child neglect and child abuse and child labor, right? So remember in your history classes, you learn about the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and there were accounts of these children that were 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and they're covered in the soot working in these factories. At least that's the image that comes to my mind, because it wasn't illegal for children to work. So we've made progress in that respect. So if you buy into the idea of moral progress, then you probably should not be a cultural relativist. Because if you're a cultural relativist, moral progress doesn't exist. It's impossible. And since clearly it seems like it does exist, there must be something wrong with at least this thumbnail sketch of this view. So why would a cultural relativist be committed to the non-existence of moral progress? Well, remember that this sort of relativist defines right and wrong in terms of culture. Let's say in terms of the mainstream culture. So by definition, if one were to oppose, or if one wanted to move away from the mainstream culture, they would by definition be moving away from morality. That's just built into the theory. So if we took a time machine and we went back to the period where there were abolitionists, where slavery was allowed, where it was legal and believed to be morally acceptable, presumably. Remember, there were a minority of people. They weren't the majority at the time. They were a minority of people called abolitionists, and they were fighting against slavery. They thought it was an abhorrent moral practice. And when we look back at them from our vantage point, it seems clear that they were in the moral right. That seems obvious to us. But if we're a cultural relativist, then we have to give a big thumbs down to those abolitionists, and we would be forced to say that their abolitionist movement was completely immoral. It was completely immoral, which sounds backwards, doesn't it? Now, why would we be forced to do that? Well, remember what the view says. If you want to know about right and wrong, just go to the tenets of the mainstream culture. And so when we go to the rules of the mainstream culture, not just the legal rules, but the moral rules, it was morally acceptable for people to enslave other people. And to say otherwise would be to go against morality. And so by definition, the abolitionists were going against that. And so they would be technically in the moral wrong. But that's very counterintuitive. Most of us, non-philosophers and philosophers alike, want to say, no, that's backwards. The abolitionists, they were clearly in the right. So that means at least sometimes cultures get morality wrong. And so you shouldn't be a strict cultural relativist if you believe in moral progress. Okay, so that was challenge number 1. Doesn't allow for moral progress. Objection number 2, cultural relativism doesn't seem to allow for any universal morals. 0. That's also baked into the definition. Morality varies from culture to culture, and there's no underlying universal morality. It just doesn't exist. But again, if we reflect on our moral intuitions, which as philosophers we're often asked to do, while we may want to admit that there are some rules that perhaps vary from place to place, culture to culture, there seem to be at least a handful that don't vary, that are universal, and that probably pretty much have to be universal if society is going to continue to exist. If we want to prevent society from collapsing, we've got to have some universal ground rules. So, for instance, a rule against child abuse or child neglect, or a rule that says we've got to take care of the next generation. If you didn't have a rule like that, then the young people, the children, the next generation, they might not make it. And if they don't make it, then there is no society. There are no humans, and we just would die off. So if you want to keep this humanity thing going, then you need to have some kind of rule that says, make sure that we have progeny, that we have children, make sure that they grow up healthy and survive, or else we're gonna, the people who are alive, we're gonna die off, and that'll be the end of the story. And so here, this universality, it might be grounded in some sort of biology or some sort of evolutionary mechanism, and that makes sense to a lot of people. So that there might be something to that. Okay, what about a rule that forbids lying or dishonesty and deceit? It seems like without a rule like that, regardless of your society of culture, without a rule like that, society couldn't function and it would collapse. I mean, think about something small like a class like this, so a college class. If it were okay for me to lie, or for your instructor, professor, or teacher to lie, then you might show up for class one day and the professor might not be there. And you might say, wait a second, when I signed up for this class, don't we have an agreement here? We're going to meet in this place at this time. Well, if you're allowed to be dishonest, then even though that was, the social contract of the college class, the professor could just go against their word and just not show up. So even if you're going to have something that society could function without, like a specific elective college class, you need a rule against lying. Imagine if we expanded that dishonesty and allowed it to infiltrate all areas of society. It would clearly collapse. I mean, think about our leaders. If our leaders were allowed to be dishonest, we might get in a nuclear war with other countries, So, there's kind of this, maybe it's spoken or written down, but there are these agreements, something like, hey, country over there, how about we won't nuke you and you don't nuke us? That seems to have worked, at least up until now, right? Hopefully it will forever. But if people could lie and be deceitful, they could go back on their word, and we might end up just blowing ourselves up. So if it's something small, like having a functioning college class, or something big, like not blowing each other up with nuclear weapons, we need to have a rule about honesty. And how about a rule against harming, even killing each other, for no good reason, or just for fun? Maybe there are morally acceptable times to kill, like self-defense or to protect somebody who's vulnerable. Okay, or maybe wartime or something. There can be exceptions. But as a general rule of thumb, no killing, no murder, without a very, very good reason, or just doing it for kicks. If we didn't have a rule like that, then it would be like those Purge movies. Have you heard of or seen of those Purge movies where all violent crime is legal for one day, but instead of it being just one day a year, it would be like the Purge every day of the year, and society would collapse because we just murder. Everyone would murder each other. So it seems like there are some universal rules, and cultural relativism doesn't allow for that, and so maybe there's something wrong with cultural relativism. Okay, let's go now to subjectivism, and let's talk about the challenges that it faces. So remember, subjectivism is a very extreme moral view. So it's a form of relativism, just like cultural relativism is. We might have called this individual relativism, because morality is relative to the individual. So it goes like this. You have your moral code, I have my moral code, and that's the end of the story. Morality isn't any deeper than that. And no one has the right to say that their morality is better than anyone else's. So that saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, if we reframe that in terms of ethics, we get ethical subjectivism. Morality is in the eye of the beholder. So that's subjectivism. Right and wrong is grounded in individual beliefs or attitudes. Now, some of you might be drawn toward this because you have your ideas and you don't want anyone else to be able to impose upon them. So I get the allure, initial temptation or allure of it. But as we can imagine, issues quickly arise. So for instance, for one, if we go with this moral view, that would entail that everyone is morally infallible. That would mean that no one ever gets morality wrong, because for someone to get morality wrong, there would need to be a standard of morality that they have failed to meet. So if there's no standard, that extends beyond individual belief, then people will never fail to meet that standard. So let me give you a couple examples. Take some obvious cases, seemingly obvious, where people messed up, morally speaking. I mean, remember that court case with that physician who worked with those Olympic athletes, those gymnasts, that were winning gold medals left and right? So there was this team doctor, you might remember this when it made headlines, Dr. Larry Nassar, and this was mind-blowing. It came out that he was sexually abusing all of these gymnasts. It wasn't just like a one-time thing. It was, talk about a repeat offender. It was over and over again. And all of these women, they provided testimony that, yep, he did it to me. So he would do these creepy examinations where he would violate all of these women. So if there's ever an example of someone who just completely went against morality, that would be an example. Or if you want more extreme, the go-to example would be like an Adolf Hitler, who committed genocide and thought that it was morally acceptable. So, don't you think that Nassar and Hitler messed up? Don't you think they got morality wrong? If you say, yes, I do. And again, are you just giving your own opinion? Maybe, but I think we want to say it's more than just my opinion. It's something more robust, more profound, something deeper than that. I'm not just saying I think they did something wrong. I'm saying they did something wrong. In a more objective sense. And if that sounds right to you, then you shouldn't be a subjectivist. Here's one other way to explain it. If we go with subjectivism about morality, then that makes morality similar to individual taste preferences. So when it comes to what you like to eat and what you don't like to eat, that might be inherently subjective. It certainly seems to be. So, I love to put avocados on almost everything, and some of you might think they're green and slimy. I don't mind a little mayo on a sandwich, let's say. Gives it a little bit more flavor, less dry. But I know plenty of people, half my family, if there's even mayonnaise in the kitchen, they'll start to lose it. And am I wrong about mayonnaise? Are other people wrong about avocados? I mean, maybe jokingly we might say, yes, if you don't like avocados, there's something wrong with you. Or, yes, mayo is objectively vile. You might jokingly say that. But at the end of the day, I don't think people will stick to that view. And that's because it seems like taste preferences really do vary from person to person. And that's the end of the story. So they are subjective. Or think about pain for a second. Pain seems to be subjective. When you're in pain. I mean, take this silly example. Let's say you go to the dentist, and you go because you have a toothache, and the dentist does this comprehensive, full examination, and at the end of it, the dentist says, turns out, no toothache. You're wrong. You are not in pain. And you're like, doctor, I'm telling you, I am experiencing pain. It would be silly for the doctor to say that you're not in pain. You know when you're in pain. It's a subjective experiential thing. So you can't be wrong about pain, and you can't be wrong about your taste preferences. Yes, I'm in pain. Yes, I like avocados, and yes, I can handle some mayo. And for anyone to criticize that and say that I'm wrong, it would just be ridiculous. Okay, so while those things perhaps are inherently subjective, we don't have to say the same thing about morality. So you are infallible when it comes to what you like, what tastes good to you, but you can't be wrong about that. You can't be wrong about whether or not you're in pain. That would be ridiculous. But it seems like you can be wrong about morality. Like Nassar got it wrong and Hitler got it wrong. So we can frame this in terms of tolerance. So let me emphasize this point. It is good to be, like we promote tolerance. We teach people to be tolerant, right? So if you do a study abroad, or you're just learning about study abroad to another place, other culture, or you're just learning about a culture where practices are very different, they might seem very, very strange to you. It's good to practice some tolerance, because not everyone is the same, and we have to be careful. We don't want to enforce uniformity across the board. That can be very problematic, obviously. But do we have to be tolerant of everything? Well, maybe it's a good idea to be tolerant of some strange cultural practices that we might find very, very foreign. Do we have to be tolerant of what Dr. Nassar did with the Olympic gymnasts? Do we have to be tolerant of what Hitler was doing? The concentration camps, these death camps. I don't think so. So tolerance in general is a good thing, but there are limits to it. No, there are limits to it, and if there are, then there's probably a problem with subjectivism. Okay, let's go to challenge number 2 with subjectivism. And that is, the view doesn't seem to allow for meaningful, genuine moral disagreements. Don't we have disagreements about morality all the time? You probably have had them in your experience. We have had them in a class like this, and maybe sometimes we're talking past each other, we're not communicating well, we're just having maybe a verbal disagreement sometimes, but sometimes don't we grow and learn from these disagreements? Aren't they meaningful? Aren't they fruitful? Aren't they genuine? Most people would say yes, philosophers and non-philosophers. However, if we go with subjectivism, then these disagreements are never fruitful or meaningful or genuine. If we go with subjectivism, we're never really even having a disagreement. It only looks like a disagreement, only on the outside, but when you dig down, the disagreement goes away. Well, you might say, why? Well, let me explain why. And this will get a little technical, and I have to say something about contradictions first to make the point. So let's do it. At the heart of any genuine disagreement is a contradiction. If we're disagreeing about something, then our two views or positions, they need to be logically inconsistent. That's where we're butting heads. At the end of the day, you're saying something and I am saying no to that something. And so that's a contradiction. You're saying something, call it A, some proposition A that you're expressing, and my views are saying the opposite. They're saying not, you're saying A, I'm saying not A. So that's the contradiction, A and not A. That's the logical form of a contradiction. And without those, we can't have a meaningful, genuine disagreement. So let's look at this Hitler. I know it's almost have to avoid kind of going to this well, but again, I'm using it to make a good point here. So let's say I'm going to have a disagreement with Hitler. So I take a time machine, I go back to the 1930s, 1940s, whatever, and I'm having a debate with Hitler. We're in the throes of World War II, and Hitler says to me, genocide is I'm not going to do I'm not going to try to do the accent, but he says, genocide is sometimes morally okay, or morally necessary, he might even say. And then I'm saying, you moral monster, no! It is not morally okay. Not morally okay. So at first blush, it seems like we're having a real disagreement. He's saying something, I'm saying something else. He's saying it's okay, call that A. I'm saying no, it's not. So that's the negation of A. But if we are subjectivists, you need to remember how we are to interpret this disagreement, how we are to properly analyze this disagreement. So when Hitler says genocide is morally okay, the way that we should interpret that is, this is hard, I'm just going to pretend to be Hitler. It means I, Hitler, approve of genocide, at least in some cases. And then when I say genocide is not okay, it also turns into this I statement. So let's focus on these I statements. So statements where the subject is I, or it starts with I think, or I approve or disapprove in this case. If you're a subjectivist, you have to analyze statements that seem to be about the world, like lying is wrong, lying's okay, genocide's wrong, genocide's okay. Those seem to be maybe objective sounding statements. They're about genocide, but you have to remember, you have to reword them into I statements. And once you do that, the disagreement and the contradiction goes away. So the genocide's morally okay turns into I, Hitler, approve of genocide. And then when I say, no, it's not Hitler, that turns into I, Ryan, disapprove of genocide. And while before we translated the statements, they did bump into each other. There was a contradiction there. Once we turn them into the I statements, they no longer bump into each other. They are no longer logically inconsistent. There's no longer a contradiction there. Why? Well, if there is a contradiction, they both can't be true. So like if I say genocide's not okay, and you say it is, we both can't be right. That's another way to put it. We both can't be right. But when you turn them into the I statements, they both can be right. And in this case, in this example, they are both right. You'd say like, huh? Well, just take the statement. I, Ryan, I disapprove of genocide. That's true, right? I really do. And then the I statement from this hypothetical Hitler, it's also true. He's also right. He does approve of it. So we're both right. If we're both right, then we're really not disagreeing with each other. If we go with subjectivism, then this never happens. There's never an inconsistency. There's never a real, genuine, meaningful disagreement. And so if you think that sometimes we do have these fruitful, genuine disagreements, these moral disagreements, if you think at least sometimes they happen, then you should not be a moral subjectivist, because on that view, they melt away, they evaporate, they never exist. And so many people gravitate away from subjectivism because it entails this silly thing that there are never genuine, meaningful disagreements. All right, so that's it for the two main objections to subjectivism and the two main objections or challenges for cultural relativism. Remember what these two views have going for them. So when we look at these views, we look at their strengths and their weaknesses. We look at the pros and the cons. We look at why we might want to endorse them, and we look at why they might be incorrect. And for both of these sorts of relativism, cultural or individual, subjectivism, what they have going for them is that they allow tolerance and perhaps ethical pluralism. And they allow some flexibility and freedom when it comes to ethics. And so that's appealing because, if you look at the extremes, if morality is too individualistic, if it's too relative, that can be problematic, as we saw with the challenges to subjectivism. It means no one ever gets morality wrong, and we're not really disagreeing with each other. But if you go in the other direction, if there's just a one-size-fits-all objective universal morality for everyone, that might be too rigid. And that's one of the challenges that a moral realist or a moral objectivist might have to deal with, is that it seems to be too inflexible. Where subjectivism is too flexible, some forms of moral realism may be not flexible enough. And then, there's an Australian philosopher, J.L. Mackie. He criticizes moral realism for ontological or metaphysical reasons, and also epistemological reasons. So the metaphysical nature of these moral facts and how we would come to know them, philosophers take issue with this. And so there's this famous argument from this Mackie thinker. He calls it the argument from queerness. He could have called it the argument from strangeness. For him, there are these important unanswered questions about the nature of these alleged objective moral facts and how we would come to know them. So that's an epistemological problem. If moral facts do exist, then they seem to be so different in kind from the sort of facts that we have established and that we are kind of comfortable with, namely natural facts. We have a whole system, we have a whole method, the scientific method, that we use to verify or to discover facts about the natural world. But there doesn't seem to be an analogous method or process in morality. There's no moral scientific method, if you will, or at least there doesn't seem to be, or if there is one, it would be quite the task to fully analyze and explain that. So that's one of the challenges with moral objectivism or realism. And again, what does it have going for it? It gives us a standard. It gives us a basis for which we can judge all human behavior, which would be refreshing, which would be nice. So we don't have to be, if this view is right, we wouldn't ever have to wonder who's right or wrong at the end of the day when there's some moral disagreement or some moral incident. we could just refer to that objective universal standard. And you see this in a lot of religions, so if there's a dispute over, did so-and-so do something wrong or not, they might say, well, we codified these universal rules into these commandments, and maybe they are sourced from some deity, maybe some God, like a 10 commandment kind of thing. And remember these non-cognitivist views, so like an Emotivism or Prescriptivism. I meant to mention before that these more generally are examples of Expressivism. So that's a big area in metaethics or in morality, study morality. Expressivism. These are the thinkers who want to tie morality more toward expression of feelings or maybe commands. And it's not so much about cognition and truth and facts and reason and deduction. It's more about sentiment and passions and desires and feelings. So that's why we're going to talk about Hume later today, because he was one of he gets a lot of credit for coming up with some of the first or basic ideas. The term non-cognitivism didn't exist until after Hume had passed away, but that certainly fits his legacy, so he gets some credit. And there does seem to be this emotional component to morality. We do have these strong emotional reactions when we learn about some event, when we it's not just that we think something's wrong, we just feel it. It's very visceral. And so Hume taps into that. So that's what those views have going for them, is they really seem to capture that gut feeling, that intuition. It's like it's really pulling at our heartstrings. There seems to be something right about that. But the challenge for those views is they don't seem to have any room for moral truth or moral belief. It seems like I have beliefs about morality, like in that debate I had with Hitler. so silly, these hypotheticals. I'm laughing at myself. But in that debate, I had to play the role of someone who thinks genocide is morally wrong. Well, that's an easy role. It's an easy character for me to play because I actually do believe that. At least I think I do. But if some of these non-cognitivists, if some of these expressivists are right, then I'm confused. I don't really have a belief. It's more about my feelings, and I'm just categorizing it as a belief, and I'm mistaken. And while maybe there's not a moral truth about every aspect of morality, maybe there are some, lying and murder, killing, and protecting the vulnerable, children, next generation. It seems like there's some truth there, even if it's not totally as universal as we might think. Doesn't have to be like true, full stop. What if it's at least just true for me or for my culture? But these emotivists, these prescriptivists, they just completely remove truth from the equation, and that might go too far. So that's the challenges for them. Good. So out of all these views, these cognitivist, non-cognitivist views, moral realism, cultural relativism, subjectivism, emotivism, prescriptivism, we now have a good understanding of what they all have going for them, and challenges and objections that they have to face.